Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. All right, the good news is there are not going to be any long speeches, not even short speeches. What I just wanted to do in the midst of a moment when so much is happening is to take this opportunity to provide you with kind of an overview, an update as to what is going on in Washington, both from a political perspective and a policy perspective. We also requested questions for this evening, and many dozens of them came in, and we'll have time to take a few, and we'll do that later on. Let me start off by saying that in these rather dismal times, and boy, you should see some of the questions that came in. They were really depressing, and I want to deal with that this evening. I want to mention to you that over the last many months, we as progressives have won some very significant victories in terms of electing people who, in the next session, they won the Democratic primaries, and they will in fact be elected. Some really great people, and you made it happen. So I know when we talk about what's going on politically, one of the most, I think, important developments over the last many years is the number of strong progressives that you have elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And this time around, we're seeing people like Greg Cesar and Jasmine Crockett from Texas. Yes, the state of Texas is sending to the United States Congress some very strong progressives. Summer Lee from the Pittsburgh area in Pennsylvania is going to be a really dynamic leader. I had the pleasure of campaigning with her in Pittsburgh. Delia Ramirez and Jonathan Jackson from Illinois will be coming to Congress, and both of them are going to be strong progressives, and I've also had the opportunity to meet with them and do a rally in Chicago. And the process, the Democratic primary process, as you know, is not yet over. Many states remain to have their primaries. Within the next 10 days or so, I'm going to be going to Michigan to join two progressive incumbent members. These are people who are in Congress right now to make sure that they get reelected. That's Rashida Tlaib and Andy Levin in the Detroit area. What is interesting about their races, and what is interesting about what is happening right now politically is that both of them are facing an enormous amount of super PAC money being thrown against them by some of the wealthiest people in this country. And obviously it's not just Rashida and Andy who have seen enormous amounts of money being used against them in the Democratic primaries. We're seeing that in many candidates all across the country who are progressive. And unfortunately, that money helped defeat very strong candidates in Ohio. Nina Turner lost in the Cleveland area. Jessica Cisneros lost in Texas. So the question arises, why are these super PACs funded by some of the wealthiest people in this country spending so much money to defeat progressives? Why? And in fact, some of them, of course, claim to be even Democrats, whatever that may mean. And the answer, I think, is twofold. First, they do not want members of Congress who have the courage to stand up to the ruling class of this country and the billionaires who dominate our economic and political life. What these guys want, very clearly, are two political parties, which will have their differences to be sure, but both parties, from the economic perspective, will be dominated by corporate interests. So that's what they want. And they don't want people in the Democratic Party who are going to stand up and say, you know what, we have to deal with income and wealth inequality. We have to make sure that workers can join unions. We've got to raise the minimum wage and all the other fights that we are waging. They don't want those guys in there. They're very clear about it. They want corporate Democrats to be nice, men and women go along with the system and not shake up the status quo. And the second reason, which is I think even more insidious, is some of these guys are putting money into elections, these super PACs into elections, where I think they know they're going to lose. And yet they're still putting money into those elections. Why are they doing that? And the answer is they are sending a message to you and to people all over this country who are thinking of running for office, whether it's for Congress or governor or school board or whatever it is, that we have our eyes on you. And if you run as a progressive, we will spend whatever it takes to defeat you. You may win, but by the time we're through with you, we're going to have ugly, dishonest 30-second ads on TV and the radio and all this stuff. We're going to make your life miserable because we are the ruling class of this country, and we don't want you messing with us. And that is the message. So their message is not only to defeat the candidates of today, but to make it clear that anybody who wants to run as a progressive, who has the courage to take on big money to fight for economic justice, social justice, racial justice, environmental justice, you're going to suffer, boy, before you get elected. That is their message. And all of which takes us to an understanding that in this country, we are not going to have the kind of progress that we desperately need until we have real campaign finance reform. And that means to overturn that disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which said that, billionaires have the freedom to express themselves by buying elections. So you got some of these billionaires out there spending hundreds of millions of dollars in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party, to buy elections. I'm a billionaire, I got a big house, I got a big car. I think I'll buy a few elections. Why not? What else am I going to do with my money? And that is just an absolute outrage. It is not what democracy is about. And we have got to overturn the Citizens United decision. And we have got to, in my view, move to public funding of elections. So if we want to have a democracy in which, you have a different idea than me, you want to run against me, go for it. That's about it. But you should not be able to buy the election. I should not be able to buy the election. These elections should be decided by the ideas that we express, who we are as people, not by the amount of money that we can raise. And the system is so corrupt. It will, I can go on for 3 hours and I won't. But just to tell you that, people are running for office. They spend half their lives on the phone hustling money because, it just takes a lot of money now to win an election. And that is absolutely pathetic. And you have the other absurd situation that in many elections, super PACs will actually spend more money than the candidates themselves have raised. So you'll have elections in which one super PAC really is opposing another super PAC, and the candidates are kind of bystanders. They turn on the TV and they see what their super PAC is saying about the other guy. Really ugly, absurd, and undemocratic. And, that issue kind of takes us to the question of, what kind of politics do we want in America, and what kind of political party do we believe the Democratic Party should be? And I think, as all of you know, that has been the struggle for the last, 6 years. I ran for president in 2016, and this became really the issue. And again in 2020, and then you have great candidates running for Congress and all over this country on the same principle. And here is the issue. It is not just ideology, as important as that is, and I'm going to get to it in a minute. It is also the nature of the political party, of what the Democratic Party stands for. Historically, at least in modern times, what the Democratic Party has been about is a relatively small number of people who were able to attract large amounts of money. They would sit in people's living rooms and raise a whole lot of money, get money from corporate interests and super PACs, and have a party which was top down, where the decisions were made at the top. And obviously, what I want to see, what I think most of you want to see, and what our progressive members of Congress want to see is a Democratic Party which is run from the bottom on up, which is a party that represents the needs of working families, of ordinary Americans, and in fact is run by those people themselves. It's not corporate guys or wealthy campaign contributors who make the key decisions, but in a democratic way, it's people at the grassroots level in a multiracial, multi-generational approach. And that is the clash that we are seeing right now. The super PACs obviously want the top-down political party, which they want to control. And those of us who are in the progressive movement want a very, very different type of party. I recently sent out a letter to supporters, and I wanted to just elaborate a little bit on what that letter contained. And what I said is that in this unprecedented moment, and I want to make it clear, in my view, we are living in an unprecedented moment. I know that word is thrown out a lot, but you know, I have never seen in my lifetime anything like what we're seeing right now. And in this moment, with so many challenges, we as progressives are engaged in many, many struggles. They come at us every single day. Right now, as all of you know, we're dealing with a real horror show with regard to climate change. You see what's going on in Europe and in other parts of the world where they are experiencing temperatures that they have never experienced before. And that means more drought. I think over 1,000 people have already died in Europe as a result of this heat wave. It will mean eventually more flooding, extreme weather disturbances. It'll mean more mass migrations, more disease. So I don't have to go into a long spiel about climate change because you all understand it. And the people right now who are in the forefront of the struggle to combat climate change is the progressive movement and many of our friends in the environmental movement. And what we understand is that it is beyond belief. It really is, because you're really now into, I would say, not politics, but really into mental illness, to think that you have people in the fossil fuel industry who still, to this day, are more interested in their profits, which are huge, than they are in preserving the planet for their own children and grandchildren. So it really, to me, is really quite crazy. But obviously, you know, as you know, climate is not just an issue facing America. You know, if we did all of the right things tomorrow, which we are certainly not doing, we would need the cooperation of China, Russia, of India, of countries all over the world, and we're not getting that. And the war, Russia's terrible, terrible invasion of Ukraine has just made that situation even worse. So this is, you know, as the scientists tell us, an existential threat to the future of the planet, and we're going to have to keep working on it as hard as we can, because how successful or not successful we are is going to, in a very profound way, impact the lives of future generations, and whether or not, in fact, you know, this remains a livable planet. So that is an issue that none of us can run away from, and I'll talk about the politics of that in a moment when we get to what is and what is not happening in the Congress. So we're looking at climate change. We've got to work on that. We're looking at creating an economy that works for all of us and not just billionaires. And I just want all of you to know that you are living in a moment right now when we are moving toward, in my view, an oligarchic form of society. I know many people don't use the term. Nobody else, I think, in Congress uses the term. I do. And what oligarchy means, you know, we talk about the Russian oligarchs, and they are. Putin and his oligarchic friends are corrupt, and they run an authoritarian country over there. Well, I got news for you. You live in an oligarchic society where you have 3 people who own more wealth than the bottom half of American families. And you have the top 1% owning more wealth than the bottom 92%. When you have a handful of Wall Street firms who are major stockholders in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of corporations all over this country. So if you took, 1,000, 2,000 people in this country, of the wealthiest people, and you put them in one room, man, those are the people who are running our economy, and they're running our political system, controlling to a significant degree both political parties. So we got to deal with that. How do you create an economy where all of our people have a decent standard of living, where you're not having half of our people living paycheck to paycheck, and this inflation that we're now experiencing has made that situation worse, where you got 18 million households spending 50% of their income on housing, where you got almost half of older workers, people 55, 60. You know how much money they have in the bank for when they're going to retire? Zero, nothing. All they got to look forward to is Social Security, and that's not a whole lot. So that's an issue that we got to work on. And then we got to work on taking on the Trumpers of the world, who, quite frankly, do not believe in democracy. Some of you may know that some of the conservative organizations actually held their conference, I think it's called CPAC, in Hungary, which is an authoritarian type country. It's a limited democracy run by this guy Orban. And they look to Hungary, as the kind of model where they want America to go. So clearly, and I think many of you are following these January 6th hearings, pointing out the role of Trump in what happened on January 6th, but the very clear effort to make it harder for people to vote, the big lie that Trump espouses that he won the election. Well, we have to work very, very hard to simply do, what we have to do to protect the United States from becoming an authoritarian society. And then on top of all that stuff, you're looking at COVID and the variants that we have faced and are facing. And I hope, by the way, in the not too distant future, to get Dr. Jha, who is the COVID czar, and a guy I like very, very much, one of Biden's best appointees, on the live stream with me, because I think we're not getting a lot of clear information as to what's going on with COVID, what we can expect in the fall, what kind of treatments are available, what kind of progress we may or may not be making on universal vaccines. But this is not only, of course, a health problem, it's an economic problem, because if people can't go to work or can't go to school, it impacts the entire economy. So we have to deal with that, and when you deal with COVID, you got to deal with the healthcare system. And I think all of you know that my view is this current healthcare system is an abysmally dysfunctional system. A study, I think it came out of Yale University, talked about the fact that if we had universal health care, we had a Medicare for All system in America, several 100,000 people who died because of COVID would not have died. And a lot of reasons for that. But right now we have some 70 million Americans who are uninsured or are underinsured. They get sick, they can't afford to go to a doctor. And in a sickened condition, COVID is more able to severely impact them, and in fact, in some cases, kill them. So, the struggle continues for us to go forward, to do what every other major country on earth does. I live in Burlington, Vermont, 50 miles north of me. There is Canada, no big deal. You get sick, you end up in the hospital, you come out, you don't have to pay a nickel. Healthcare is a human right, true all over the world. So that is an issue that continues both as part of COVID, but just as a human right. Healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. We've got to end the role that private insurance are paying, the role that drug companies play in forcing us to pay the highest prices in the world. So that's an issue we've got to keep working on. And then, again, I don't have to tell anybody who's watching this that a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court came down with one of the more ugly decisions. We had, as I mentioned a moment ago, Citizens United, which is going a long way to undermine American democracy. And now these guys have come up with a decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. And it is, sometimes you can say, well, I disagree with the decision, but this is not even disagreeing with the decision. It is just hard to imagine that in the year 2022, you have a majority of members on the Supreme Court who believe that women are not mature enough or intelligent enough to control their own bodies, and that we need the government to do it for them. I mean, it is literally beyond belief. So, the fight continues to protect a woman's right to control her own body, to codify Roe v. Wade, to make sure that we help women who are trapped in states where they can't get an abortion to be able to do so. There's a lot of stuff around that. But it is something that we as progressives continue to work on. And obviously another issue that's out there, and we saw this in Texas last month, the horrible, horrible mass shooting at the school there in Texas, which is part of a process that we see all over the country of mass killings. Some of them are not as well publicized as others, but you're seeing it all over the place. And the truth is, we have hundreds and hundreds of millions of guns, including AR-15s, guns designed specifically not for hunting. My state, a lot of people hunt. That's great. Target practice is great. But these are weapons that are designed to kill people as quickly as possible. So we got to figure out how we deal with the gun violence that we're seeing. But what I want to say, in the midst of all of these struggles, where we're fighting back here, we're fighting back there, we cannot simply, in my view, remain on the defensive. At a time of obscene income and wealth inequality, at a time of outrageous corporate greed, at a time of growing concentration of oligarchic power, it is terribly important that we contrast our vision for the future of this country, our values, what we stand for, against those who wish to defend the status quo and our corrupt political and economic systems. So, what do I mean by that? It means that this is not, in my view, a time to retreat. It's not a time for just tinkering around the edges, which is a lot of what goes on in Washington right now. The truth is that the American people are desperate and hungry for a new direction for this country. You look at the polls out there, poll after poll after poll. Do you think America is moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? Answer: wrong direction, overwhelming. Whether you're conservative, progressive, moderate, that is what people think. So I think the American people are desperate for a new direction economically, politically, and morally. And we as progressives cannot allow other people to define who we are. That's what the media does. Far left extremists, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump. We don't have to accept that. We have to define who we are. And we must not be shy about demanding the bold and systemic changes this country desperately needs. And just in terms of values, this will seem obvious to many of the viewers out there, but we got to be proud of what we stand for. For example, greed, which is the dominant element in our economy today, is not good. We should not be raising our kids to be greedy. It is beyond belief and should be attacked. That you got multi-billionaires out there, people are worth $100 billion, $150 billion, more money that they will could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, who are saying, well, I only got $100 billion, I need more, and I'll crush union organizing efforts, or I'll make sure I don't have to pay my fair share of taxes. Hey, who can get by in these days with $100 billion? Greed is not good, and that should not be the dominant element of our economic system. And from a moral perspective, forget the economy, we should make it clear. that the growing gap between the billionaire class and everyone else is not good. It is not right that during the pandemic, when 1 million Americans died, when tens of thousands of workers had to go to work to do their jobs, died, that the billionaire class saw something like a $2 trillion increase in their wealth. And the gap between the people on top and everybody else is growing wider. CEOs that make 350 times what their workers make. That is a moral issue, not just an economic issue. And we should make it clear. And as I mentioned a moment ago, when we talk about our political system, we should be very clear. Buying elections is not good. You know, instead of falling into the trap, well, how do I raise enough money to get elected? We got to sit back and say, you know what, that is not what democracy is about. And that's, as I mentioned a moment ago, why we have to overturn Citizens United and move to public funding of elections. And then we also have to make it clear that producing carbon emissions and destroying the planet is not good. Yeah, that's a tough sell. You know, you shouldn't destroy the planet. And yet these guys in the fossil fuel industry, they are distinguished businessmen and women, my God, upright citizens. Oh yeah, they're about to destroy the planet. And we should make it clear that from a moral perspective, that is not acceptable. And we should make it clear that starvation wages and the exploitation of workers are not good. You know, the turnover rate in a company like Amazon is huge because people are being crushed by the job. They work in very hot warehouses. They work and they work. They can't get the breaks that they need. And you're seeing that all over the country. There are people out there, many of you maybe, who get zero vacation time. You know, people in America working just incredibly long hours. So starvation wages, and we haven't raised the minimum wage for a very long time, the exploitation of workers is not good. Another issue that we should talk about is that war and excessive military budgets are not good. You know, recently there's a military budget coming down the pike, increase of $40 billion. You're into $800+ billion for the Pentagon. And by the way, that is the only government agency that has never even been audited. All kinds of greed going on, all kinds of illegality, cost overruns, profiteering. But it's okay. We just throw more money into the military because the defense contractors can make a whole lot of money off of that. And, you know, we should step back. And when we talk about health care, very simple question is, should we maintain a dysfunctional system in which insurance companies make tens of billions of dollars off human illness? Does that make sense to anybody? Or should we be putting our money, and we spend almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as the people of any other country, into doctors? We don't have enough doctors. Into nurses. We don't have enough nurses. Into dentists. We don't have enough dentists. Into other medical personnel. Is that where we should be investing? Doing preventative health? Or should we be spending money, giving money to insurance companies who are just robbing us blind? And there's another issue that I'm going to get into, I think, increasingly in the next few months, and that is corporate media. And we don't talk about it enough. Needless to say, corporate media doesn't talk about corporate media. But I want you all to know that we are looking at a situation in this country where a relatively small number of corporations control what we see, hear, and we read. And let me just give you a few examples of this. Many of you may know, and some of you don't, that the owner of, just say, NBC is Comcast. And sometimes we have the illusion that when you turn on TV and you have 50 different channels, wow, this one is here. We have all these choices, but the truth is, it turns out that many of these companies are owned by the very same people. So in terms of NBC, it is owned by Comcast, and obviously MSNBC and CNBC are owned by Comcast. Comcast also CNN is owned by AT&T, and AT&T is the major stockholders there are Vanguard and BlackRock, who are the major stockholders in Comcast as well. Disney not only owns ABC, it also owns ESPN, A&E, the History Channel, and a number of other channels as well. It owns Hulu, Lifetime, Marvel, Touchstone Pictures, and Pixar. So when you look at media, what you end up finding is that the media is controlled by a relatively small number of people. And the criticism there, it's not the attack on fake news that Trump makes. You know, I deal with media all the time. Many of these men and women are hardworking, they're honest. It is the limit of discussion, the kinds of issues that we are allowed to talk about. So I never get asked about income and wealth inequality, never. I never get asked why the United States is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people. Never get asked how it comes about that we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Never get asked about the concentration of ownership in this country. And I'm never going to be asked those questions because that's not the kind of discussion that corporate media wants to have. All right, I've gone on longer than I intended to. So if any of you are still out there with me, let me go to a few questions that came in this afternoon. And I gotta say, you know, we received, 50 or 60 questions, and a lot of them were kind of pessimistic, and maybe we can deal with that. So let me start off with a question from Rose. I don't know where Rose lives, but and her question is, where do you think activism has succeeded? And that is a very good question. And I think, Rose, if we take a look at American history, which apparently increasingly my Republican colleagues don't want us to do, but if you take a look at American history and you see about how change came about, in almost every case, it came about through the mobilization of people, who we would call activism. I'll just give you a tiny example. Just today, I attended a rally on Capitol Hill with cafeteria workers who work in the Senate cafeteria. And they have formed a union, they're trying to get a contract. To make a long story short, the people who run the system here sent out a letter that they were laying off 52 cafeteria workers and other workers. Well, these workers who were organized stood up and fought back, and you know what? The guy who makes that decision rescinded it. They didn't see 52 workers laid off, and they're going to eventually get the benefits that they're entitled to because they stood together. And you know, you go through the history of this country, whether it is the terrible things we did to the Native Americans when the settlers first came here, or the horrors of slavery or Jim Crow, the only way the change took place was when people stood up and fought back. You know, we're talking about women's rights now. Well, you know, it was a little over 100 years ago where women didn't even have the right to vote. And yet because of the activism of women, putting pressure on the ruling class of the time, they got the right to vote. You know, when I was mayor of Burlington, this is, you know, not 200 years ago, there were no police officers who were women. We appointed the very first. It was like, women, police officers. Women couldn't be doctors. Women weren't lawyers in large numbers. And all of that changed, and it changed because of activism. Gay rights, the same thing. You know, years ago, people who were gay were very afraid to acknowledge that for a variety of reasons. Activism changed that. You know, what do you think the civil rights movement was about? Taking on Jim Crow and segregation and all that. That was people coming together, blacks and white supporters coming together and saying, you know what, this is not tolerable. So, you know, I think if you look at the history of America, it is the history of activism, trade union movement. You know, people are earning decent wages and benefits, safer working conditions. It wasn't an accident. It's because workers stood up and fought back. Next question is from Owen. And Owen writes, what keeps you hopeful? Well, can't say that's totally true. I'm not always hopeful. But what I can say in my position, as a senator and, somebody who's run for president, is I have seen a lot of things that are really beautiful and that do give me hope. Just earlier this week in my office, I met with about 15 young people who were Israeli and Palestinians. And they are working together to end the kind of horrible position that the Palestinian people find themselves right now in Israel. And it's beautiful, really wonderful, smart, dedicated young people. So when I say, and I've seen that many, many times, seeing young Israelis and young Palestinians coming together, trying to deal with the very serious environmental problems, economic problems in Israel, coming together, trying to rebuild Gaza, etc., etc. Just this morning, as a matter of fact, I met with a woman who is a vice president of Spain, and she is part of a progressive party there, and she was telling me about all of the things that they are doing in Spain, and I was very, very impressed. And in the afternoon, I had lunch with a fellow who's the ambassador from Finland, and you start talking about the enormous progress that not only Finland, but Scandinavia has made, where healthcare is a human right, education is a human right, where income and wealth gaps are much, much lower than they are in the United States. And you say, you know what? I am hopeful. If Finland can do it, and Sweden can do it, and Norway can do it, you know what? At the right time and the right place, when we get our act together, we can do that in the United States of America. And you talk about why am I hopeful? I go out and I see and speak to a lot of beautiful young people out there. We see young people organizing in the Starbucks to form unions at Starbucks. Great young people, enormous courage in standing up. So, I am lucky because I have the opportunity to get around the country and see a lot of people and meet a lot of people. And when you see people in this country, a lot of great people, black and white and Latino and Native Americans, really good people who are doing their best to create the kind of nation that we need to become. So that's kind of why I am hopeful. And there's another question, not dissimilar from that one. It's a question from, I'm probably mispronouncing it, Gemma, and she writes, I have found it hard to avoid doomerism. How do I avoid losing all hope? And then another question that comes from Patrick, is it ever going to get any better? Should I maintain any will to live? Now that's a little bit, makes me nervous, Patrick. Yes, you should maintain a will to live. And, look, these are very tough times, and I think what we have to do is be honest about it and say these are tough times, but these are not the only tough times this country has experienced, or the American people have experienced, or the world has experienced. The 1930s, during the Depression, 25% of people in this country were unemployed. You had children working in fields, children not going to school, working in fields, in factories. In 1941, when we had to deal with both Japan and Germany and the rise of Nazism and Japanese imperialism, we weren't prepared to do that in 1941, but the country got its act together and literally in a few years built the economy and the armed forces that we needed to save the world from Nazism. So, these are tough times, but it is not appropriate for us to live in despair, because what all of this is about is not just us. It is about our kids. I have 4 kids. I have 7 grandchildren, and you do too. And we are fighting for not just ourselves, but for the future and future generations. So it seems to me that despair is not an option. This is tough stuff. And the victories are not going to be easy. We are facing enormous enormously powerful opposition. But throughout history, that has been the case. People have faced enormous opposition, and things change. Things get better. So, and all we can continue to do is to keep fighting. We got a question from Allison, who writes, who were your political heroes growing up? And let's see, I think there were a couple that come to mind. One of them was a guy who many of you may not have heard of. His name was Eugene Victor Debs. I think he died in the mid-20s, 1920s. Debs worked in the railroads as a kid. He became the leader of the American Railway Union, one of the first large unions in America. And then he ran for president of the United States, I think on 4 or 6 times, I don't remember, and brought people together around what we would consider today a progressive agenda. And while he never got more than 7% of the votes, the ideas that he made popular really ended up becoming, I think, an important part of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in 1932. And in addition to that, Debs spoke out against World War I. And essentially what he said is that why are working people killing themselves, going in countries just going to war killing each other? Why don't we try to build a world that works for everybody? And of course, for saying that, which seems to me to make a lot of sense, he went to jail for 3 years. And when he got out, he was pretty ill. But check out Eugene Debs. In fact, there was a very good documentary done, and we played it on live stream. And one of the remarkable things, he was in jail, and he was such a saintly kind of guy that all of the prisoners there just began to love him. And when he left prison and he walked out, his prisoners were banging the walls and just shouting out at him. And he remarked that it was one of the more touching moments in his life. And the other person who you have heard of was Martin Luther King Jr. And when you turn on TV on his birthday, they'll be talking about the march on the big march on Washington, where he gave his I Have a Dream speech. I happened to have been there, so that was a very beautiful day, very important. But the truth about King goes deeper than the corporate media talks about. And the reason that I am so respectful of him and admire him so much was that, he became, quote unquote, very successful as a civil rights leader, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And at any time, he could have said, wow, I got the Nobel Peace Prize, I'm famous, I'm all this stuff. And you know what he did? He didn't do that. What he did do is take on the entire establishment and say, you know what, this war in Vietnam is wrong. And if I am going to be telling people all over the country that nonviolence is the path forward, that if you want to fight racism and segregation, you have to do it in a nonviolent way, how can I not speak out against the unbelievable violence that was taking place in Vietnam? And you don't know this. I mean, a lot of people don't know this. But when he did that, he stopped being a hero in the media. He got ostracized. And people were saying to him, who do you think you are? You're a civil rights leader. Why are you speaking out on foreign policy? And the money that was coming into his organization dried up. And not only did he have the incredible courage to speak out against the war in Vietnam, he also took on the economic establishment. And, as I think many of you know, when he died, he was not in a civil rights demonstration when he was shot. He was helping garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, get a union. That's what he was doing. They were exploited terribly. And he went down there to stand with the union, and in his last months, he was organizing a poor people's march to bring black and white and Latino and Native American workers, poor people together, to say, we have got to change the priorities of America. We shouldn't be spending so much on the military. We should be spending it on the needs of ordinary people and creating an economy that worked for all. In fact, just yesterday I was on the floor, I won't go into it in great length, in opposition to a major piece of corporate welfare, I quoted him, and what he was saying, I got the quote a little bit wrong here, but paraphrasing him, he said, in America, we believe in socialism for the rich, which is exactly what this bill is about. We give huge amounts of corporate welfare to large corporations, and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. I have a lot of admiration for his life and the struggles that he waged. Last point that I want to make tonight, because I know it's on a lot of people's minds, is the dysfunctionality now of Congress. And what you got here is not complicated. You have a House, and they deserve a lot of respect. The margin that they have in the House is not much, and yet they have passed very good and important legislation. And one of the reasons for that is the great work that many of the progressives that we have supported have played in the House. So the House has more or less done its job. And the problem, obviously, is where I work, which is in the Senate. And in the Senate, we have 50 votes, 50 people in the Democratic caucus. That's 48 Democrats, 2 independents, myself and Angus King of Maine. And the Republicans have 50 members of their caucus. So it's 50-50. And the only way that you can pass significant legislation without Republican support is with 50 votes plus, in a tie, the Vice President of the United States. And more or less that is how we passed the American Rescue Plan, which to my mind will go down in history as one of the more consequential pieces of legislation for working people. I think you all remember it. That was the $1,400 checks, the expansion of unemployment benefits, the massive aid that went to small business, that went to schools, that went to hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. Very important piece of legislation. We passed that with 50 votes. The infrastructure bill that was passed was bipartisan, not as far as I would like to go, but it was a significant step forward in rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. But what we have not been able to do, because we have no Republican support, and because we have 2 corporate Democrats that get a whole lot of money from billionaires and corporations, and that is Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema from Arizona. They have prevented us from passing Build Back Better legislation, which I work really, really hard on, which really would have been transformative. It would have finally done what the American people wanted to see done in the economy, in healthcare, in climate, in childcare, you name it, we addressed it. But Manchin especially has sabotaged that legislation to where we are today, which is something that is very, very minuscule. So I have, disagreed with many of my colleagues in the Democratic caucus because I kind of understood 6-7 months ago that Manchin was not serious. And I thought we were just going down a dead end by trying to negotiate and negotiate. And the end result is that the people in this country are now very demoralized. And I think it would have been better 6 months ago for the president, for the Democratic leadership, Pelosi and Schumer, to say, you know what, sorry, we don't have the 50 votes that we need to pass voting rights. We don't have the votes that we need to pass abortion rights, to protect a woman's right to choose, to pass Build Back Better, to pass serious gun safety. We don't have the votes, that's all. And I think the American people could understand that. We don't have the votes. You got 50 votes, to pass a judge or a Biden nominee, that's fine. But you don't have the 50 votes that we need to pass serious legislation. And we should have made that clear to the American people. And, it's something I said 6 months ago. And then bring forth the real legislation that we need. Bring forth real legislation to lower the cost of prescription drugs, to expand Medicare, to demand that the wealthy start paying their fair share of taxes. Let Republicans vote against it. So at least, and let Manchin and Sinema vote against it. But at least then the American people could see that there's an agenda out there that many of us are supporting. But, that wasn't a decision that the Democratic leadership felt comfortable with. So we are where we are. So on that note, let me say that I think we have a moral obligation to continue to stand up and fight, to recognize that, yes, these are tough times. But as human beings, we cannot turn our backs on future generations. We cannot turn our backs on the most vulnerable people in this country who are really hurting right now. So, with that, let me just thank you all for being with me, and to tell you that next week, by the way, we're going to have a live stream, a really great one. You're not going to just hear me talking. We're going to have some of the most progressive labor leaders in America who are doing a great job in helping us to build the labor movement. Sean O'Brien is the new president of the Teamsters, one of the great unions in the country. Sarah Nelson has been reelected as president of the flight attendants. They're the people who serve us when you're on a plane, and she has done a great job. Chris Smalls is the founder and leader of the Amazon labor movement, labor union. He'll be with us, and we'll have some local leaders as well, I think. So I happen to believe that, when you talk about being optimistic or pessimistic, one of the best things that's happening is we're seeing, to some degree, a rebirth of trade unionism in this country, of people coming together to fight for economic justice. So come back next week, Wednesday at 8, and we're going to have a great live stream with some of the best labor leaders in the country. All right, thank you all very much. See you soon. Take care.